Hello, Inside Great Minds listeners. This is Adam Outland, your host, and today we get to interview our amazing guest, Constance Dierickx. Constance holds a PhD in clinical psychology, focusing on decision science and crisis intervention. Her decision-making strategies have been implemented by leaders at organizations that include IBM, AT&T, the CDC, Lincoln Financial Group, Cox Enterprises, many more. And now she's sharing these unique strategies in an upcoming book as well, Meta Leadership: How to See What Others Don't and Make Great Decisions. Constance and I have a great interview in this session. She is relied on by top leaders when they're faced with consequential high-stakes decisions. And we dig in and unpack a little bit about that, her strategies, her approach, and how she got to where she is today, doing the work she does with executives and leaders on decision making. Couldn't think of a better guest to have on the Inside Great Minds, so please help me in welcoming Constance Dierickx. But yeah, I kind of want to dive in just to jump around your life timeline a little bit.
Okay.
But instead of starting at the beginning and doing it chronologically, I'd love to know a little bit, just a little bit about who you are today. Like, just you published your fourth book. You're doing. I've read consulting, some consulting work with organizations and individuals around this concept of decision making as well, right?
Constantly.
Yeah, it's a big part of
It's a theme. Yeah.
So yeah, just talk a little bit about how you arrived at this fourth book today. What concepts you're helping companies and individuals with, and then we'll kind of backtrack.
Okay, great. Well, someone asked me recently how long it took me to write the book Meta Leadership: How to See What Others Don't and Make Great Decisions. And I said 6 months and 25 years.
Wow.
And that's because the idea has been germinating for a very long time, going back to my days as a stockbroker. I was a retail stockbroker years ago, and I was haunted by, and I remain haunted by, why smart people make dumb decisions, or decisions that look dumb from the outside, and sometimes decisions that even they would say in hindsight were not smart. And I've learned that people don't always make dumb decisions because they are dumb. In fact, people you're around all the time and the people I'm around all the time are smart. They're smart, they're educated, they're successful, and people in all walks of life are smart. You can find smart people everywhere, but we make bad decisions in part because we're human. And there's a lot that's been written about cognitive error, and later we might talk a little bit about Kahneman and Tversky and their research. It captivated me years ago, and yet I know, because I'm a clinical psychologist, that decision making is not a purely intellectual act, and humans are not rational actors. And so meta leadership is a new paradigm that incorporates thinking and how to use metacognition to improve your thinking, emotion, and being aware of your emotions and the interpersonal and social context, which has got emotional aspects to it as well. And then behavior. How do you use your own behavior? How do you observe others' behavior? And how do you observe your own habits of behavior?
And so if you're working with an organization, what does it look like to help them with decision-making skills? How does one help a collective with being a better decision makers?
It's usually a small group that I'm working with. It might be a board of directors that I'm working with. Often it's a CEO or a C-suite executive on their own. And what it looks like is, it looks like conversation. If you had a camera in the room, but the sound wasn't on, you would have no idea what we were talking about. Occasionally, I'll stand up and draw something on a whiteboard, but it's a back and forth conversation with them telling me what the situation is, what they're trying to do, And there's a lot of conversation about what are the barriers to the organization going further, faster in the direction it wants to go, or sometimes helping them figure out what direction they do need to go in. Not because I'm telling them, I'm facilitating, helping clients gain a strategic direction. A lot of what I'm doing is I'm pointing to things that they might not see that I think might be true. And of course, sometimes I'm not correct, but I'll say, do you think it could be this? Or what about that? Or what do you know about your customers? Or, and then I'm doing a lot of reframing. So one executive said to me one day, I need to get better at negotiating. And I said, why do you think you need to get better at negotiating? I thought he was pretty good. And he said, blah, 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 whatever he said. And I said, are you comparing yourself to Joe? And he looked at me and he goes, oh my God, because you are a psychologist.
Yeah.
You don't have to be a psychologist to see that. You just have to be observant. And so that's an example. And I mean, we both laughed. And he said, I'm so relieved. I said, don't hold yourself to that standard. You're good enough at that. And he happens to be a very good leader that I worked with on the most successful merger his company ever did. And I was his almost invisible co-pilot. I'm often not, most people in organizations don't know I'm there. But I sort of rode shotgun with him for over 2 years, and it was a fantastic, he did an amazing job. Yeah.
That's awesome. It's,
Yeah.
I have outside the podcast world, I do executive coaching and sales developmental coaching, and that's what our firm, Southwestern Consulting, does. And so just having that intimate one-on-one relationship, it often is about how you ask questions,
Right.
how well you can read between the lines of their own responses, because people, especially people that are in the weeds, have so many blind spots, don't they? That they can't see themselves.
Yeah, and it's they're partly blinded by massive data and information. You know, they've got all these ideas coming to them through people, through reporting, and it's not always easy to separate signal from noise. The other reason is because they sometimes don't get out of their office. So, you know, if you're working in such a way that you're exploring their territory, and as a consultant and advisor, I'm exploring their territory. If I'm working with a restaurant company, guess what I'm doing? I'm eating in their restaurants. You know,
Yeah.
it just real simple stuff like that. You know, I'm digging through a website, and then I can say, you know, it's impossible to find out who your IR person is, investor relations person is, and they're like, really? Because they're not doing that. So sometimes it's helpful to share with them what you see, as well as listen really just with great discernment to what they're telling you. And, you know, you might have this happen to you, is they tell you things that turn out not to be so true, right? Occasionally, right?
Yeah, a little,
And if you
hyperbole.
help, yeah, if you help them see it, you not only help them see something in a new way, but then you can take them through the process of how does that information come to you? Who's generating that information? Who set these criteria and metrics? So that's a lot of how I work, is I ask questions, but that is only possible once you've established a trusting relationship. Once you have the trusting relationship, you can ask a lot of questions. But
Yeah.
before you have it, if you start off pitching some methodology,
Yeah.
you might have a client or a customer, but that deep relationship will elude you.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing about what you said at the beginning, that decision making is often not logical. And I'd say it's almost never completely devoid of emotion, right? And
Well, it's impossible for it to be. And we have the research from biochemistry and neuroscience to prove it. There's no such thing as an emotion-free decision. But if you say that to somebody who prides themselves on being really rational,
Yeah.
they'll scoff.
Hide it. Yeah, exactly.
So I only say that to people like you that are, you're 90% of the way there already. So,
well, it made me think of the fact that what you just said, that I think carries a lot of weight, because we deal with this in the sales area quite a bit, which is that in order to influence some person's decision making, you have to emotionally create trust. Otherwise, I mean, you can have all the best solutions in the world, but if there's no implicit feeling of trust, then they're not going to hear what you're saying. And that's what I heard you just say there, that I thought was valuable.
yeah, I think that, when you go into a meeting with a prospective client, and I coach other consultants to grow their businesses, so I teach them your only job in the first few minutes is to build rapport. That's your only job. If you have your PowerPoint slides in your briefcase and you're worried about how long you have to wait to pull them out, you're distracted. Don't be distracted. Be fully present with the person. And then, you need to demonstrate empathy, but also directness, and go from there. Personally, I don't use PowerPoint slides. I almost never use them. And one day I went into a CFO's office and I had one slide. I had done a diagram that I thought would be helpful to him, and I put it on one slide and I slid it across the table, and he looked at me and said, "What have you done with Constance?" Because I don't go in with a brochure. I have no brochures. Right. I'm simply having a conversation, and it may lead to business, it may not, but I always want to leave the person with some value and some sense that I heard them. They may decide I can't help them. That's okay. That's all right.
And I kind of want to get your, I know this is a little bit of an aside, but it's something I wanted to ask you that I just recently heard on, I don't know if you ever listened to Wisdom from the Top, Guy Raz's podcast?
Yes, I love Guy Raz. Yeah.
So he interviewed, I don't know if you listened to the one Uncharted by Margaret Heffernan, who also kind of, her spin and conversation is always making decisions on data or not. And she takes the don't make so much data-driven decision-making approach, and her kind of philosophy that sometimes we overcomplicate things with data in her.
All the time. Yeah.
So yeah, I was curious your take, and if you speak to that at all in this book about what is the appropriate amount of data to use in decision making versus intuition, or what is the best kind of pathway of is it how you interpret data? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Lots.
Okay.
So I have two answers for that. One is that there's no such thing as only using data, because the person using the data is going to choose which data they're going to use.
Right. That's right.
That is not a purely intellectual decision. Now, I will say that there are exceptions to that, where, let's say you've got something that's very scientifically driven. You're doing research, you're launching a rocket. You better be looking at the right data. But I don't think it's an or. I think it's an and meta leadership is all about, the book is all about the mistakes we make because we are creating these false dichotomies. If we accept that all decisions have some emotion in them, then I think we should always be using data and emotion. Emotion will guide us to what data to use, but then we can use our good brain also. Let's not leave the brain on the bench to say, and this is part of metacognition, standing back or leaning out and saying, what data am I choosing to look at? And am I cherry picking that data so I get the answer that I have known for the last 2 weeks that I want to get? That's a tough one, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't think that data is bad at all. If I want to know what my blood pressure is, I want data. If I want to know what flavor ice cream to choose, don't tell me about the fat content, because I'm standing in the ice cream shop. I've already decided I'm going to have ice cream. So don't distract me with
Yeah.
what, oh, we should get the sorbet because it doesn't have any fat. Yeah, but it's full of sugar, so there are times for pure emotion. If you think about it, how on earth would any of us ever fall in love if we thought that only rational decisions were the correct ones?
Mhm.
That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. Now, hopefully you fall in love, but then you bring your good brain to the party and you say, does this person share my values? Are we compatible in all these ways? And by the way, I recommend everyone go seek marriage counseling before they get married, because it really brings to light important conversations that most couples in the full bloom of love don't really want to talk about, like money, for example.
That's right. Yeah. Or you could be like us and wait a tremendous amount of time before you get married. So you've gone through all the phases before.
Right, right.
But no, I 100% agree and believe in that completely. So let's take a trip back in time here. So
Sure.
you're the decision doctor today.
Yes.
But if we went back 20, 30 years, I mean, like, how do you get into, you as a young person coming up? I mean, did you just know I want to do, I want to do day trading, or I want to be, on the stock floor, and then, I want to help you with decisions. I mean, it's generally not people's life paths. So how did you get there, and how did you get to where you are today?
Well, very circuitously. I think a really fortunate thing for me was I grew up in an entrepreneurial family. My grandfather retired from the paper industry in Chicago, where I'm from originally, and he and my grandmother retired in a little town in Florida called Cocoa Beach. And he got bored and ended up being one of the people to start the town's first bank, and then he did a bunch of other things. So we moved there when I was in first grade, and I grew up hearing a lot of conversation about finance and development of real estate and all these things that didn't make a lot of sense at the time. But now I understand that my grandfather was good at seeing unmet market needs. That's how I summarize it now. It took me years to be able to put that language on it. But I also understood that people who are willing to take some risk, a smart risk, could do quite well. But I was a college dropout, and in like the late 1980s, I was a single mom I had 2 daughters, still have 2 daughters. They're grown up now. And I was selling computers because I needed to earn money.
For
And
IBM.
then IBM entered the market and decimated prices and margins, and I was selling more and earning less. And I thought, well, this is not going to work. So I went to the library and I looked up best paying jobs, like literally, like, what's the best paying job? And one of them was stockbroker. And so I began to do research on what stockbrokers did and what brokerage firms looked for. And I knew I didn't have a college degree, so I was going to have to be extra good. And I interviewed with 5 brokerage firms that I did not want to work for, so that I could practice and learn. I had no idea at the time how really smart that was. I know that I'm flattering myself, but that was pretty creative at a minimum. So I got turned down by all of them. And I went to the Merrill Lynch office in Asheville, North Carolina, and asked to see a guy that I knew. And he said, well, what brings you here? And I said, some of your competitors are trying to hire me. Yeah. And one of them hadn't turned me down yet. So I would, it was like so he said, well, white lie. So I got the job and I went to New York and got trained, and I hated it. I hated the job, but I'm coming back to where we started, which is I was haunted by my clients, who I liked my clients very much. and I was interested in helping them, but sometimes they just did the dumbest things with their money. And the worst ones were college professors, physicians, and accountants.
Hmm.
The worst, because they knew everything, or I thought that they knew everything. I'm probably over dramatizing it in hindsight, but so I began to study decision science by going to the bookstore down the block called Malaprops, and I started reading business books, books on decision science, and then books on psychology. And I was going back and forth in the bookstore between these sections, thinking, these things need to be merged. Why isn't someone doing that? And then lo and behold, a few years later, I learned about this guy, Daniel Kahneman,
Yeah.
who at the time was a professor in Israel and doing research with Amos Tversky. So I've always been focused on decisions. And then, one day a client said to me, "Do you know what you are?" And I thought, oh, this sounds ominous. I said, "Tell me." And he goes, "You're the decision doctor. You help us make the most consequential decisions."
Wow.
And I immediately thought, that sounds like a brand.
Wow.
And so I backed into the brand. It wasn't like I created it. I'm some marketing genius. I let my client tell me. And that, I'd been consulting for over 10 years at that time.
Wow.
So, and then I've taken it and tried to approach things from that angle as much as I can, with the idea of trying. What drives me now is a desire to provide information and ideas to people that's helpful.
That's awesome. And so you
Fun.
really self-educated in this career. Like you went through the school of
Well,
picking up and reading
yes
books.
and no. I left out the part that, in the interest of time, that I left Merrill Lynch and went back to school. And I finished my bachelor's degree. I had dropped out of school. I finished my bachelor's degree and was very encouraged by I switched majors from poli-sci to psychology, and they encouraged me to go to grad school. So I went, I was very lucky to get in at Georgia State in Atlanta into the clinical program, which is at the time had a 2% acceptance rate, which fortunately for me, I hadn't noticed when I applied. Otherwise, I would have been more terrified than I was. And I spent a long time as a grad student, which is typical in my field, and I loved it. So I got a PhD. I'd been a college dropout, and then I got a PhD. And what that has done for me, it's given me a lot of credibility to encourage other people to never give up. Don't give up. You want to go to school? Go to school.
Yeah.
You live in a country where it's possible. You're
Yeah.
not shut out. And that is so fortunate that we could do that. And I was, there I was, a grown up with teenage children, and I was a full-time student. How lucky is that?
Yeah, that's amazing. It's almost like a combination of the statement that Jim Rohn used to make, a famous speaker. He said, formal education will get you a job, and a self-education will earn you a fortune. And I kind of hear you merging those two things, because it was the self-education that kind of led
So
you
right.
to formal education.
Yeah,
Right?
you're so right. I love that. The word autodidact. I love that word. And I think that the most successful people I work with they do both.
Mhm.
They learn in formal settings, and they also are self-taught, and they're often big readers.
Mhm.
And of course, I'm showing up in their office fairly often with some book, Bob Cialdini's book, Influence, Dan Pink's book, Drive. Those are both fantastic books. I lean a little more toward, drier stuff, I guess, academic stuff and philosophy. So I don't often show up in a client's office with Man's Search for Meaning, for example.
Yeah.
But
It's a good
a
one.
lot of great leaders have read it.
Yeah.
And if you mention it, they light up and they go, "Oh yeah, that's powerful. That's powerful."
And so in this journey that you've had, um, what do you feel like, and I think you've kind of alluded to this a little bit, but what have been the the self-experience of decision making that you've gone through? I mean, what were some of the hardest decisions that you've personally been like, well, gosh, I guess I get to read my own book on this. We've all had those moments. I'm a sales practitioner and I get to like go through an experience where I'm in that seat again and go, oof, I need to
Right.
go back and revisit my own training. And
Right.
so, just humbly, like, what would have been the biggest challenging decision
Right.
you've been confronted with in growing this brand, writing these books?
I think that a very pivotal decision was leaving the consulting firm I was with. I
Mm,
joined a small global firm as soon as I was done with grad school. In fact, I started working there 2 weeks before I defended my dissertation. And you had to have a PhD in psychology to get hired. And
mm.
I didn't have it. I was 2 weeks away from it. So it was sort of like, well, if you flunk your dissertation defense,
Yeah, you're
Um,
done.
so I joined the firm and I was there 12 years, became a partner, helped them grow the CEO transition practice, and learned a lot. Every time I got bored, then something new would happen. After 12 years, I decided that I didn't see anything in front of me that looked like a big learning opportunity, big learning opportunity. And I was pretty successful at business development. And so I quit my job
Mm,
and started my own firm. I started with, I had a really tight non-compete, so I couldn't work with any former clients. So I started out my first month, I made $3,500 and was happy about that. In
yeah,
hindsight, that's
yeah.
kind of ridiculous. Like, well, what are you going to do with that? Uh, but I worked hard on relationships,
Mm,
and I maintained relationships with people without pitching them.
mm,
Um, so that I mean, I was very strict about abiding by my non-compete. I did get hired back by the firm as a contractor. We had a very amicable, it wasn't an ugly separation. I gave a good reason why, and I didn't criticize anybody or blame anybody, which I really advise people don't sling mud on your way out the door. It doesn't do you any good. But then, after a couple years, I was doing better financially. But
mm,
that was a huge decision. It felt like a big risk. And then I would say the second decision, it started out feeling big, but now I do it all the time without giving it a lot of thought. And that is investing in myself. I've had I've had the same mentor for going on 2 decades now. I invested a lot with him. I've invested in other people as coaches, as mentors, I've hired writing coaches. I've been in mastermind groups. I've spent a lot of money on myself. And what I would say to your listeners is investing in yourself is one of the very best things. In fact, my husband jokes because for a while, he was the only one in our family with a job. He had a job and both daughters and me were in college at the
yeah,
same
yeah.
time. And, he tells our friends now, she's the best investment I ever made.
That's perfect.
And he's always supported me and encouraged. I'll say, oh, I'm going to join this mastermind group with Dory Clark. We're going to meet in New York. And then we got this thing in London. What do you think? And he goes, you should do it. It's
Mm,
always, he's always trusting my judgment. So that's another important thing is to have people in your life that are pulling for your best self.
mm. And I hear in what you just shared something that I think is, I won't say this for you because you may disagree. But I don't think you will. And that's that,
We'll see. Let's
well,
find out.
that, when you're coaching people on a certain thing does not necessarily have to mean that you do it perfectly in your own life.
Oh,
Um, in fact, it's actually the value is that you're third party to them, and so you're not entrenched in the same emotions they are when you're
okay.
providing guidance. But in our own world, we are, and we know we're influenced by that. And so the value that I heard in what you said is when you bring in a mentor and coaches into your personal life, we do the same thing because we know that we can help other people. But looking in the mirror at our own blind spot sometimes is challenging because we're in the emotional weeds of our own practice or life,
That's
right?
right. That's right. Yeah.
Um, Go ahead.
No, that's absolutely right. And it takes me back to my graduate school experience where I was in a clinical. My specialty is clinical. That's what my degree is in. I also studied organizational psych at the same time, but it was highly recommended that you be in therapy through
Mm,
graduate school.
yeah.
And that was a really good recommendation. It happened that I'd been in therapy once before and liked it, found a tremendous amount of value in it. Um, and so I remained with my therapist, a Jungian analyst, for 5.5 years. And I found great value in it. And partly pinging on what you said, it's to be able to live unashamedly, but not boastfully,
Mm,
with the reality that helping someone else doesn't mean that that you're perfect, that you don't make mistakes. And I loved it when I was teaching university students, and somebody would say something like, well, but you're a doctor and blah blah blah, like I'm on some pedestal. And I said, well, let me just tell you something. I graduated from high school dead center of my class, solid C average. Woo. Um, Classic underachiever, high standardized test scores, terrible grades, bored
yeah.
to death. And then I was a college dropout.
Mm,
But here's the good thing: you can pivot anytime.
mm,
And if
mm.
college isn't suiting you right now, it's okay. You may not need it ever, but if you want to come back, you live in a country where you have access to higher education.
Yeah.
Maybe we're not all going to Harvard, but I'll tell you, I got a great education.
Yeah. And it was under when you knew the path that you wanted to take at your time, and that made a big difference.
That made a big difference, and being more mature made a big difference because in hindsight, I went to college at age 18, and the high school I went to was a really good public high school. A huge percentage of the kids in my class went to college. It was sort of like you had to go to college. But I was like, I I was going to be a lawyer. I was a poli-sci major. I was going to be a lawyer. No, that doesn't suit me at all.
Yeah.
So I was goofing around, and I went when I was. You're right. I knew what I wanted to do, but I was also much more accountable for my own behavior when I was a bit older.
Yeah. Yeah. And I see that. Part of the little subset that I started 3 years ago of our consulting company was a coaching program for youth. So like middle school teenagers and college students, under this pretext that you hear it all the time from executives are like, gosh, if I had known that principle or had that thought when I was younger, it would have made all the difference, you
Right.
know? And so my question to you, I guess, is what's some advice? And I know this can be, you're giving nuggets instead of the full book that
Yeah.
we encourage people to read. But what are maybe just some nuggets that you feel like on a personal level are really valuable that you've written about as it relates to making hard decisions?
One is to pay very close attention to who and what is pressuring you
Mm,
to make a particular decision. I was a poli-sci major the first time around in college because that's what my father wanted me to do. And I said I was going to be a lawyer because that's what my father wanted me to do.
mm,
And the pressure to do it was much greater than I realized at the time. So once you're a grown up and you can be a little more meta in your awareness. And meta is from the Greek. It just means above or beyond, beyond our understanding. And no thanks to Mark Zuckerberg for using that. It's a prefix, Mark. It's not a whole word. Anyway, so I would say, had I somehow been able to give myself the space to think more above and beyond, and it's interesting because I do that quite naturally. I'm an extremely conceptual thinker. I think that that's important. In the book, I talk about why we should all stop leaning in all the time. It's a little bit related to what you were saying earlier, Adam, about, sort of staring at the data. And one of the things I like to say is, if you wait until your feet are wet to know the tide is coming in, you've been staring at the spreadsheets too much. Yeah. You haven't lifted your head up. So rather than leaning in as a universal good, I say sometimes you need to lean in, but people don't lean out enough to see the whole. And then the other aspect to that is understanding the social and interpersonal pressures on people. I mean, the research is so incredibly clear about what happens when people in a group where there's too little ability to safely disagree. Bad things happen. Look at the Challenger explosion. If you read Richard Feynman's addendum to the Challenger report, that's what you see in spades. And that's really scary. And my apologies to all the people I grew up with who worked at KSC for their whole careers. It can happen. If it can happen to literal rocket scientists, then why would the rest of us think that we are above it?
Yeah, we're literally lives are at stake. Absolutely.
Right.
And you do see it. It's this kind of interesting thing where you work with a leader who will tell you, like, no, I love feedback from my team. But there's unstated factor that they don't realize happens. Or that they have these little moments where they shut someone down and it creates the behavior change, right, in their organization, where there's no incentive to, in their mind, to bring this. There's very little upside to challenging or bringing this. There's a lot of downside.
You are dead right about that. And I would add something. You don't have to shut people down. All you have to do is ignore them. And if you ignore them in public, then everybody knows that they're not your favorite. So I'll give you an example. A CEO that I knew in I better not say the industry, because I'm like, what if this person listens? This continent, this CEO, yes, in the United States, this is in a medical environment.
Okay.
It would have these big meetings with, I forget what the name, cabinet, the whatever, the senior team. It was a cast of dozens. It's way too many people. But whenever certain people would talk, he would pick up his cell phone and start reading it, or, doing something on his cell phone. That is a passive way of communicating. Whatever that person has to say, I don't care. It's not important. I don't respect them, which begs the question, what are they doing sitting in the meeting? Right.
Yeah.
And I actually picked this up from Francis Fry. Well, of course, I was observing it in this person, but Francis Fry, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, talks about leaders need to pay attention to whom and under what conditions they're not attending. I'm saying this very badly, but she got me thinking about that much more deeply than I would have thought of it otherwise. And she and her wife, Ann Morris, work together as consultants, and they have a fantastic podcast called Fixable. Little plug for them. I was listening to it right before you and I got on this,
okay.
on this call, so it's top of mind.
Well, if we could tie up on one thing, it would be this, I guess. What,
Yeah.
as the decision doctor now, having written the books you've written and learned what you've learned about decision making,
Yeah.
what advice would you give a 21-year-old Constance? If you could go back and just provide her a little context for the future, what are some things that you might share?
Ah, I would say to use your good brain to be more thoughtful and less given to reactivity. So
Hmm.
I think that one of the ways I've matured, and probably aided and abetted by my therapist when I was a graduate student, was that when something happens that makes you have a strong emotional reaction, unless there's a fire in the building or, somebody's shooting at you, you have time to think about how you're going to respond. And it's back to Viktor Frankl's between stimulus and response. We have choices. And I'm pretty sure that people gave me that advice when I was 21 years old. And I was probably not
Good.
listening. I was very much a typical young adult trying to figure out, what's my path. And in hindsight, a lot of that was pretty normal. And there were some unfortunate circumstances that really fanned the flames of that behavior. And I'll spare your audience the details about those, but some things that were hard,
Yeah.
that made me a little more jumpy, a little
Yeah.
more anxious. And
Sure.
that's different than who I am now. But, I'm a lot older now. So, and I have a really, really happy life. I
Hmm.
think having a happy marriage, a happy home life, and great friends and colleagues goes a long way to helping us act the way we want,
Hmm.
show up in the way that makes us feel proud instead of ashamed.
Hmm. Yeah. This is really good. I mean, I think what you're sharing, just personal anecdotes, but also,
Mhm.
I think your book sounds really, really interesting. Like, I'm looking forward to picking up and reading a copy. Where can folks find more about the work that you do, individual or group, and where can they find your book?
Well, you can, I think all major book
Amazon,
retailers.
real retailers.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's in Barnes and Noble. Barnes and Noble did a national order for the book, which is really
Awesome.
exciting.
Yeah.
Um, and people can learn more about my work by either connecting with me or following me on LinkedIn. I publish a newsletter every 2 weeks called The Decision Doctor is In. And then my website is myname.com. And my name, that's a problem, right? It's it's a really unusual name. The good news is I'm the only one.
That's right. Yeah. You don't have to worry
Constance
about any
Dierickx, yeah.
posers out there.
Yeah, constancedierickx.com. And in a matter of, well, by the time this is released,
Yeah.
there will be a meta leadership self-assessment on my website in the resources section, and people can just download.
Hmm.
It's a series of questions that follow the 3 categories of the book: metacognition, emotion, and behavior. And it's meant to be a thought-provoking exercise that people can do on their own. It's completely free. No, you don't have to pay for it. And then I appear on podcasts like this one, and people can listen. One of the fun things about podcasts is they're all different.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So Adam,
Focus.
you and I had a conversation that's different than the other conversations I've had. And you've provoked thinking and different answers in me that others have. So thank you for that. That makes it really fun.